All right. Welcome to, this is February, isn't it? Welcome to February's ELTS webinar. Very thankfully sponsored by, excuse me, Mark Algren, who is an ELTS trustee. He was a past TESOL president from 2009 to 2010. And also, he serves as a commissioner on the Commission for English Language Program Accreditation, or CEA, which we're all familiar with. So we want to thank him for his sponsorship. My name is Michael Fields. I'm at the University of Delaware. And today we want to talk about what's new in assessment. And we're going to start this out with a poll. So I'm just going to give you there are two questions. So I'm going to give you about a minute or two to answer this poll. So if everyone can do that, please. And remember, there are two questions.
Sorry, I'm making noise.
Can everyone see the poll? I see one person. Good, one person's answering.
Can you have more than one answer?
Yes, yes, okay. Absolutely. For both of those questions, you can choose more than one answer. All right, anyone still working, or can I? Oh, it looks like someone is. If you need more time, if not, I'm going to end the poll. It looks like people are still clicking. All right, is there anyone who objects if I end the poll? Okay, let me end the poll. And I just want to share, before we go on, I just want to share that, like last time, for those of you who were here last time, this is very much an interactive webinar. I don't want to be the one that does all the talking, so I really think we can all learn from each other. So please, questions, comments, interruptions are all very, very welcome. I'm not good with looking at the chat while working online. So just go ahead and shout out anything that you'd like to say. And again, I really believe that I am not the font of all knowledge here, and we really all have things we can add to this conversation. So as you can see, the two questions, one was about new assessment practices in a traditional classroom, and then the second question was more about online assessments and some modifications that we may have had to make, that we've all probably had to make because of teaching online.
Hey, Michael, let me just, can you take away the initial page, unless you wanted to leave? No, I mean, no, you still got Mark Aldrin's picture up and what's new in assessment.
Oh, we'll go on. That's.
Oh, okay. I didn't know if that was, I didn't know if you knew it was up there.
Yeah. Okay. So can everyone see? I've shared the responses, so let's see if everyone can see that now. Can you see the responses, everyone?
Would you share again, please?
I did.
Oh. You need to click on the polls and you will be able to see them.
Click on what?
Polls.
Oh,
I've done it.
Got it. Thank you.
All right. Okay. All right. So it looks like actually only 2 out of 7 are familiar with integrated assessment, only 1 with automated speaking assessment, 1 with dynamic assessment. And when we get to these points, I'd love to hear your perspective as well as we get to these points. I hope it's not the same person that's answering yes to all of these. 2 people with reading into writing, only 1 with dictogloss, and 3 with audiovisual listening test format, that's very interesting. And then about online learning, which let's see if we get to that topic today. And if not, we might save it for another day. 4 out of 7 said face-to-face testing is generally better than online testing. 3 out of 7 said online testing has some advantages. So those are really in opposition. So let's hear what everyone has to say when we get to that. Often we cannot be sure of what we're really testing when testing online. 2 people agreed with that, and the rest didn't want to say. Security is the biggest issue in online testing. 3 people agreed with that. And online testing has taken us back to the era of indirect testing. No one agreed to that. I wonder if that means that no one knows what that means, or if actually no one really agrees with that. So let's go ahead. And over to you. I would like everyone now to just take a minute and describe an alternative assessment that you do in class. And when I say alternative assessment, really what I'm talking about is anything that is not a sort of traditional pencil and paper or nowadays, computer screen tests like multiple choice or writing an essay under time conditions, etc. So I'd like to hear from you an alternative assessment that you use in your classes. Who'd like to go first? Marla, how about you? Natalia, you look like you were going to say something.
Well, would portfolio-based assessment count as an alternative way of assessment?
Portfolio, absolutely, absolutely. Mariana.
I'm sorry, I was talking to somebody else. I have people in my office.
Who else would like to chime in with an alternative assessment that you do already?
We are doing capstone projects. Teachers have to, I teach teachers and they have to present progress on their capstone.
Okay. Marla.
Sometimes, sorry, in a reading class, if we finished reading a novel or we're reading it, we have students do a project based on it, a poster about the characters, or turn it into a skit, or make a comic book.
Mm-hmm. And
make
those
sure
are
that
actually
they-
assessments. I mean, they're great.
To assess their understanding of overall what the novel was about.
Mm-hmm. Great. Christine.
I would have to go with posters, kind of poster sessions to explain data and information that we've talked about.
Okay. Lindsay, are you coming in from Brazil, Lindsay?
Originally, yes, but I'm in the States now.
Okay. Okay. Lindsay, can you give us an example?
Well, going back to what was said about reading novels, usually at the end of a novel, I would do something that I call creative writing, so to give them a chance to get, some ideas outside the box a little bit, connected to the writing and to their own experiences, but not necessarily worrying about, all the mechanics of writing necessarily, just give them the freedom to express themselves and connect their own ideas and feelings to the story in a creative way. So I guess that could count for alternative assessment.
Okay, wonderful. Jacqueline, I think you just joined us, so welcome. And are you coming from Montreal, or do I remember? I think I met you at a conference before.
I'm at California State University, Long Beach, in Long Beach, California.
So I think it's not you then that I'm thinking of. Okay, great.
Probably not.
Do you want to give us an example of an alternative assessment that you already use?
Well, I'm sorry, I'm just joining now.
Yeah.
I'm the director of the American Language Institute. So I'm not teaching a course this semester. So I need a minute to think about. I've been very focused on formal assessment. We just submitted our 5-year CEA report, so my head is in SLOs and other things. I need a minute to catch up.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, let's go ahead then and look at some current trends in assessment. So I think one of the things that we're seeing now is more formative assessments, moving away from large summative assessments and more towards formative assessments. And we'll talk more about what that means in just a moment. more alternative assessments and less sort of standard-based assessments. And we just talked about alternative assessments, right? More direct assessments as opposed to indirect assessments. And again, we'll talk in just a moment about what that means if you're not familiar with that. And finally, more integrated assessments. So what are formal assessments? And again, I'm just inviting everyone to jump in here if you want to add something or have a question or etc. Right? So formative, remember that no assessment is by its nature either formative or summative. Assessments can be used formatively or can be used summatively. So it's all up to how we attempt to use those assessments that we've created. Formative assessments tend to be smaller and more frequent. They tend to be lower stakes. So that means that students are less tempted to cheat, right? When they feel that it's lower stakes. When we use formative assessments, we are giving our students more opportunities for feedback. So we're more likely to share the results, to discuss how they can improve based on the results of these tests. And they might be, they might be as much for us and our teaching as they are for students and their learning. So formative assessments really try to emphasize the role of tests in student learning, or sometimes we call that assessment for learning, rather than these summative measurements that are really judgments of learning and that students never have the chance to go back and try to improve based on the assessment. So any comments about formative? And as I said, this is a direction that that we're going towards now in contemporary assessment. Any comments about formative assessments from your own experiences or?
So Michael, is this a chance for to be able to do these formative assessments again and again? So you give them feedback and then they can redo the assignment or redo the assessment again so that they can learn from how they're doing, or that assessments may look the same across units so that they're doing the same kind of activity over and over again?
Right. So I think when you talk about allowing students to retake assessments, I think that's really a question of if you're testing for proficiency or mastery, right? I believe, and I don't know what anyone else thinks, but I think when we're teaching towards mastery, for example, lists of vocabulary words would be a good example, or grammar points or some other kind of declarative knowledge. If we do give a test and students don't do well on it, why not give it again, right? Why not allow them more time to learn? Why not allow them a chance to see what they haven't mastered and try to to attempt that test again? Whereas if we're doing a more proficiency testing, which is more direct testing, right, which would be essentially reading, writing, listening, speaking. So not that kind of declarative knowledge. In other words, not tests that you can just go home and study for the night before. Then I think it's probably, maybe less productive to try to take that same test again. That's my feeling, and I don't know if anyone else has a different idea. Any other ideas about that, or?
Well, I don't think we would repeat the same test either. I think if we're doing them, which we do a lot of formative assessment, because I think it's much more productive for the student, right? It engages the student in a more meaningful way. It helps the teacher see what's going on and where things maybe are, need to be recycled or need to be revisited. But then next time around, even if you're asking on the same type of issue or the same body of vocabulary, you're not going to construct the same questions, right? You can still test again with other items. So I think that's more useful. And then use those for study guides, maybe the ones that didn't go well.
So one thing I actually do, thanks to being online on Canvas, is I actually I do test vocabulary in one class that I teach. It's a pre-academic course for sort of intermediate, upper intermediate students, and we do a lot of explicit study and testing of vocabulary. And as I said, thanks to Canvas, I do give them 2 chances to take the test at the same sitting. So they're allowed to take the test, get the results, see which items they got wrong, and they're allowed to go back and attempt. They don't, when they see the results, they'll see which ones they got wrong, but they won't see the right answer. But they can go back on a second attempt and try to re-answer those very same questions. And the idea being, and I know that for some people might feel that's controversial because it sort of goes against the grain of what we all have understood what a test is, right? But if we subscribe to this belief that we are assessing for learning and not assessing of learning, then why not allow the students to, if they have really studied these, and why not have them try again, and maybe they can get it right on the second try. So it's kind of I mean, we'll talk about dynamic assessment in a few minutes, I hope, and maybe that's just putting one toe in the water of dynamic assessment. But I know that's a controversial opinion.
Marco, do you ever use group testing? I mean, where you take the students, you got 20 students in the group, divide them up into 4 per group and let them work on the test together. And while they're teaching one another.
And that's a really good example of dynamic assessment. And personally, I don't do that, but there's a lot of theory behind that. Absolutely. Absolutely. Anyone else that's using, I think no one answered about dynamic assessment, or maybe one person answered about dynamic assessment. Is there anyone else that would subscribe to what Perry just said? Christine, yes?
Yeah. I mean, I've often thought that more brains are better than
come on in.
just one. So I've often put students in groups to complete tests or projects, bigger projects.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right, let's go ahead and talk about, let's make a very loose definition of alternative assessments or performance-based assessments. And essentially, I'm going to define this in a negative way. So I'm just going to say that alternative assessment is everything which is not your traditional paper and pencil test, or, these days it's more likely to be on a computer screen, but your sort of multiple choice, true, false, or here's a prompt. You have 1 hour to write an essay under time conditions, etc. So anything that is not that, I'm just giving some examples here. I'm sure you can think of a lot more that aren't on this list. So things like essays, stories, plays, and poems, developing, right? Writing stories, plays, and poems, portfolio assessment, video and audio recordings that they do on their own outside of a sort of tested environment, right? Timed environment. Projects, journals, oral presentations, role plays, debates, interviews, reflections, and peer and self-assessments. We could put all of these in this basket of alternative assessments. So any comments about, I mean, if anyone is doing these sorts of things already and would like to share it, I'd love to hear that. It's a very shy group.
Michael, I just wonder, some people use computer testing, paper pencil testing, and I know some of these, like journals, projects, of course, don't apply. But I'm also thinking in terms, I'm looking at a test that a conversation test that is graded by artificial intelligence, and trying to determine whether such is worthwhile. But I don't know if teachers are using these in the classroom or not, or creating these in the classroom or not.
Right. I wouldn't put that in the, I mean, that's another absolutely important issue that we can talk about in terms of where assessment is going these days. But I wouldn't really put that under the umbrella of alternative assessments, only because that's a very formal standard assessment, right? But absolutely a big issue today. Yeah.
Well, we use lots and lots of these because I think, when you have a student-centered approach, you're going to want to have as much production and practice and integration and multiple ways for them to engage and multiple exposures. I mean, you're always going to want to do these things, right? They need to be able, I mean, it's like, yeah, you can take a discrete test on the vocabulary item, but can you actually use it? You know,
Right.
you can take the discrete test. I mean, we know these things, right? You can take the grammar sentence level thing, but can you use it in a way that, you know, it is meaningful and accurate? And so most of these things I think are built into most effective language learning rooms. So they're certainly in ours across levels, and in our intensive English, in our MBA prep, in our short things, we're doing a lot of these. Yeah. But
Yeah.
we also design, you know, rubrics, which we work on collaboratively to try to weight and give a meaningful feedback, and actually use these so that they're not so subjective, right? That they can actually align with the learning outcomes that we have. So I don't see that there's a problem with that and actual measurement of learning outcomes if the rubrics and other measures are clear and get reviewed regularly.
Yeah, and I think I want to just add something to what Jacqueline said, because she used the word multiple like 3 or 4 times sort of at the beginning of her comment. And I think multiple measures is really key here. And the more different ways that we can try to assess students, the better the picture that we get. So when we think of, let's just imagine a classroom where students come in and they know that they're going to get 4 traditional assessments throughout the course. And at the end of those, we sort of add those up, and maybe they're weighted, and we somehow get an average. And that's our outcome. That's our student outcome. It's not really as robust of an outcome as if we can also, you know, collect different, multiple ways to see students' progress or ability, right? And when we look at just what's on the screen in front of us, these sorts of alternative assessments, I think, really allow us different ways to see the students' proficiency and their abilities. So absolutely, I think that idea of multiple measures is a really good one. Any more comments about alternative assessments before we go on?
I have a question. So all of these, they're wonderful, and I've done them. But with my group right now that I'm working, I like to present some of these, but I think rubrics will make it more. I guess my question is, do I need to create rubrics for all of them to really make sure that I'm assessing for learning?
I'm wondering what anyone else would like to say about that.
Well, I think that it's really, what is the purpose of the class, right? And so is it that they can, what is it you want them to be able to do? Do you want them to be able to pass a discrete item test, and to what end, right? Or do you want them to be able to have some control over certain features of language, over certain kinds of task types, that they can successfully do them? And then you build your measure around those things. So for us, I'm interested in the student having the agency with the language. So there are discrete item tests that assist with that goal, but there's a lot of alternative. And yes, multiple is that's a high word on my list, because how are we giving the student the opportunity to show us? And how are we giving meaningful feedback? And how does it align with it? For me, it's, you know, the outcome, the objective, the assessment, right? Formal or informal, we need to know, did the students succeed, and how do we know? Did our material and our curriculum and our instruction succeed? And how do we know? And that's not necessarily what you're calling formal assessment. A lot of it is alternative, but it can still be, in my opinion, measured.
Yeah, and I think just to go back to Letty's question, I mean, she was asking about rubrics, and I think Letty attended our webinar last month when we talked about rubrics. And you know, my input, which, you know, I'm sure many people will disagree with, but I think in any performance-based assessment where there is any measure of original student production, so we're talking not about trying to assess reading or listening here, but when we're trying to assess speaking or writing, and there is significant student production, independent production, we can only adequately measure that with a rubric. I don't see any way around that, really. Mm-hmm. So, yeah. And again, you're going back to one of these discussions that we had last time. Should we have a separate rubric for every task, or should we have a general linguistic-based rubric that's general enough to capture a range of tasks? And that's that's a big issue. And we talked about that a bit last time, and we didn't come to any agreement on that, which is no surprise for me. Let's keep moving and talk about direct assessment. So I think this is a term that most people are probably familiar with, but just to review, direct assessment comes out of communicative testing. So an older model of testing was discrete point testing. I'm sure we're all familiar with that. Or integrative testing was another model. But in the contemporary world, we're really usually doing some kind of communicative testing, which means we're trying to measure skills directly. We're trying to measure reading by having students read something. We're measuring writing by having students produce writing, and not by some kind of indirect measure. We don't try to measure grammatical correctness or declarative knowledge, and assume that those things sort of add up to this skill that we're not measuring directly, which is essentially what discrete point tests tried to do in the past. We also, as I said, we don't want to focus too much on just correctness, but we want to look at communicative competence. We want to look at a student's range of production, and we want to really focus on what students can do, and not how many errors they make in the course of any kind of language production. Of course, we do want to measure somehow their grammatical accuracy and their control of vocabulary. Of course we want to do that. But those are only a part of their productive skills, and that we really try to measure through a communicative performance. So this is essentially what direct assessment refers to. Any comments or questions about that? All right, we'll keep moving on. Integrated assessment's another one of those things I mentioned, right? Essentially, the theory behind integrated assessments. This is one of the ways that we're moving towards in testing, in modern testing. In authentic language situations, we're usually using more skills than one. We're not only using, we're not isolating reading or isolating listening in most authentic language situations. So integrated assessment tries to capture that and build authenticity into assessment by just capturing that fact that we are usually operating in more than one skill at once. So just an example would be if students have to read a text, and maybe some of you will recognize where this comes from, but students have to read a text and then listen to a talk on the same topic, and then they have to write about the topic or speak about the topic, or they may need to use examples in their own language production from what they've read and heard. This would be an example of an integrated assessment. I know one of the criticisms of integrated assessment is that we need to be even more careful when we do integrated assessments, that we're sure of what it is that we're measuring, because sometimes we can get lost about just what it is that we're truly measuring when we try to integrate skills. So this is integrated assessment. Any comments about integrated assessment before we go on? Anyone using integrated assessments now?
Yes, we are. I don't know if others are. I built a
So in
number
this
of these
example,
tests. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Letty.
that's all right. In this example that you have here, you can choose which part you're gonna assess, or I mean, you can choose just the text or the listening or the writing, right? Or you can select all of it. I mean, how is it usually done?
Right. Well, I guess there's no usually, but like this, the TOEFL uses integrated assessment, and what TOEFL does, as you probably know, is that there is a reading, there is a measurement of reading, and there is a measurement of listening, but then there's also a production, and the production, since the production depends on the reading and the listening, and this is one of the criticisms of integrated assessment. We're not sure that we can actually isolate the writing skill or the speaking skill, because it depends on that input, right? So, so in some sense, we're maybe on the productive skills, we're retesting things that we've already tested. So that's right. And other examples of integrated testing might be a listening and note-taking exercise, a reading, which many of you said you know what it is already, a reading into writing exercise, dictogloss, or dictogloss response, or dictogloss summary. And I just want to talk about those for a few minutes, because very few people indicated they're familiar with what dictogloss is. So I'll just take a few minutes to go over that. Unlike a traditional dictation, and I think we all know what dictation is, where someone reads a text and students write down every word, and it's read slowly enough that students can copy down essentially every word that they've heard. Unlike a traditional dictation, a dictogloss asks students, so you read something to them at a natural rate of speech, and they either alone or in small groups try to reconstruct the text. So while they're listening, they take notes, and then they try to reconstruct the text as close to the original as possible. And they need to do that essentially through memory and through using a range of skills, right? And if they're working in groups, they're also speaking, they're negotiating meaning. Of course, they've listened. Of course, they're writing. And then we can add on a response. So if the actual dictogloss is one paragraph, and we ask students to respond to that with their own ideas, then we have a dictogloss response. Or if we give them a longer reading and they can only summarize it instead of trying to reconstruct the text entirely, then we can call that dictogloss summary. So these are also examples of integrated testing. And the reason these are integrated is because of the range of skills that students are asked to use. So again, in a dictogloss response, they're going to listen, they're going to speak to each other. If they're in groups, they're going to write. They may read each other's, as they work together to reconstruct the text, they might read each other's reconstructions. And then when they respond, they're actually doing a kind of independent writing task. So that's why we would consider this an integrated testing example. Okay. Let's go into dynamic assessment, which I think we touched on already. And this essentially, dynamic assessment, this is from Vygotsky, by the way. The theory is that in authentic situations, essentially learners rarely act alone, or people using language rarely act alone. And in an authentic situation, our performance is not stable, or it's not static. We can grow through our performance and improve our proficiency, improve our language ability over time with practice, with the interaction of other learners, and also with feedback. And this is essentially, all of these concepts are what dynamic assessment tries to capture. So dynamic assessment would be most likely a performance-based assessment. It wouldn't really be a traditional paper and pencil test. Students would be allowed to collaborate. And as Perry suggested, even if they collaborate on a traditional test, although I think in a real dynamic assessment, we might not see a traditional test, we might see some other kind of performance-based assessment. But students would be allowed to collaborate. They would be able to plan their performance together. Students might be allowed to receive feedback during the performance or even before the performance. They might have some kind of rehearsal. And students might also be asked to reflect on their own learning afterwards and maybe attach some kind of reflection as a part of the assessment. So all of these would be examples of the elements of a dynamic assessment. And let's just look at a few examples. Let's imagine that in this assessment, students in pairs are given a scenario, and I'm just giving an example here. They might have to plan a vacation to an eco-tourist location. And in order to do this, they have to call a travel agent. And in this case, it would be a real call to a real travel agent, if travel agents exist anymore. I don't know. Did Travelocity put them out of business? I'm not sure. So they might have to create a list of questions that they would ask on the phone. They might show that list of questions to the teacher beforehand and get feedback. And of course, the teacher might not make exact corrections, but might suggest the kinds of corrections that students might make. The call would be recorded, and students might reflect on what they did well and where they need to improve. This would be an example of a dynamic assessment. Another example would be that in pairs or groups, students are given a topic to research, and they're allowed to watch videos and read about the topic beforehand. They'll meet with the teacher to have a group discussion. After they've researched their topic, they'll need to meet with their teacher and have a group discussion. Some of the questions they might answer easily, some of the questions they might not be able to answer, and they might be, if those that they haven't been able to answer, they might be sent back and asked to do more research before having a second meeting with the teacher where they're given another chance to answer those questions that they weren't able to answer the first time. And these are just some examples of dynamic assessment. So any comments on dynamic assessment here? I think someone's speaking or the volume's not up enough, or any comments?
Well,
I think students really like these. They really like the level of engagement. We do one where, and I've done it in my own classrooms too, where, you know, if you're on a campus, students have to go and investigate a student service and they come back and report. And that way they're also learning about what's on the campus, things they can do. There are all kinds of different interviews and information they can gather, and that all gets shared and they love it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So I think things like this that engage them and give them opportunities to negotiate with other speakers are really successful. So you get a lot of student buy-in.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And they do that in pairs or small groups?
Mm-hmm. You can. If it depends on the level, right? But if they're paired, or it's a lot less intimidating for them to go out and do it. If they're in a pair or a small group, it's more successful than, you know, go to the union and interview people. That won't work now in COVID, but it's also, that's very difficult. But if they have an office, even if it's the student life or, you know, like the student services, the campus side, the student union kinds of offices where there are a lot of other students, super successful, and it takes that edge off. Yeah, pairs are nice, but if they're higher level, they can just do it, which is also scary, but you set them up really well in the task, and then they feel really good in coming back and doing it. But they need to be higher level.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And these are actually what you're referring to. These are actually assessed tests.
Yeah, because they come back and they do a presentation. You've already set up, right, like what you're talking about. You know, what are the interview? What are all the steps of what's the plan? Where are you going? What kinds of materials are you going to try to get? What kind of things did you find before? What are your sets of questions? Are you going to practice in class before you go do it to get the edge off? Are you going to, and then come back and do a presentation for everybody, because everybody's got a different place. You're not hearing the same presentation 5 times. Everybody's gone somewhere else.
Right, right. Wonderful, wonderful. Any other comments on dynamics?
We've done this with even beginners. We've sent them off to the public market, and with a set, they develop the questions ahead of time in class. They practice pronunciation to get the questions so that the vendors can understand them. And then they go off to the public market, ask the vendors questions about their vegetables, the cost, the price, you know, simple things that beginners can handle. And then we ask them to record it on their phones so that we could then review the interactions that they've had and what was successful and what wasn't.
Right. Wonderful. Yeah. Yeah.
So I have a question. What's the difference between this dynamic? It seems very nuanced to me, and integrated assessment. To me, they're almost the same because there's several skills in play.
Yeah, the dynamic assessment is, I mean, it has a theoretical basis in Vygotsky's rejection of these traditional tests, which he, you know, criticizes as static, and where students take them alone. And we're talking not about really about alternative assessments, but about your sort of standard paper and pencil test that students take alone. They get one chance, and we believe that this has captured a picture of student performance, when in fact, you know, according to Vygotsky, again, in authentic language situations, we're often working with others, and we can develop based on the performance. We can develop, and we're allowed to get feedback. So I think that's really the theoretical basis of where dynamic assessment comes from. Yeah. Let's go ahead and talk about assessing pragmatics, which I'm very happy we have time for. And again, this is something that's becoming more more common and more thought about in language assessment is not only the not only assessing at the lexicogrammatical level, but also what is the use or the function of language, and how successful are our learners at being able to use language for pragmatic purposes, right? So we're sort of moving away here from the lexicogrammatical focus, and again, that is a lot on correct form, and again towards the use of language for communicative purposes. So I just put this image of an umbrella because we can put so many things under this umbrella of pragmatic. So when we're making requests, apologies, refusals, compliments, giving advice, making complaints, agreeing and disagreeing, any kind of indirect speech, when we're using formulaic expressions or being familiar with formulaic expressions, implying implying feelings and moods, opening speech acts, closing speech acts, interrupting successfully, maintaining the floor. All of these things are examples of language pragmatics, which traditionally have not been tested whatsoever.
Michael,
yeah, please.
If I could just add to that, you're correct, it has not been tested. I did a little bit of research trying to find pragmatic tests anywhere in the world for English learners, and to the best of my knowledge, they do not exist.
Wonderful. Well, let's jump to one right now. I'm so happy you said that, because I'm going to prove you wrong.
Okay. All right.
And let's see. I need to do a new share with sound. And I want to just show you this example. Where is it? Has it disappeared? Sorry, I'm just going to need to, just a moment, bring this up, I think.
I can't believe my research was faulty, Michael. I mean, that's unheard of.
Well, it's a lot like my research then, if it's faulty. Okay, now I should be able to share this, I hope. Let's see. Yeah, great. So this is the part of the PET, just one part of the PET listening test, and it's from it's a Cambridge English assessment. Let's go ahead and watch this video. So this is not a productive skill. This is a receptive skill. There are other examples.
Now turn to part 4.
Can everyone hear it?
Questions 20
Great.
to 25. Look at the 6 sentences for this part. You will hear a conversation between a teenage girl called Anna and her father about a party. Decide if each sentence is correct or incorrect. If it is correct, put a tick in the box under A for yes. If it is not correct, put a tick in the box under B for no. You now have 20 seconds to look at the questions for part 4.
So these are pragmatic test items?
Yeah, and let me, I just stopped the video for a second, and I just want to, let's have a look at the questions. So Anna begins by asking her father. So this is not something that we can, this is not a question that we can answer by listening for the facts, right? Anna's father is worried about her. Well, how are we going to know that? Anna's father insists that she leave the party at midnight. How are we going to determine that? How are we going to know that? So let's really listen. This is, I think it's about 4 minutes, the sound file. Let's listen and see how these answers are given to us.
Now we are ready to start. Listen carefully. You will hear the recording twice.
We'll hear it only once.
Are you busy, Dad? I've got something I want to ask you. I've been invited to a party on Saturday. Would you give me a lift there?
Where is the party then?
It's at Tom's house. His sister's 18 on Saturday, and they're having a big celebration. It's going to be brilliant. They're having a disco, and Tom's mum's a wonderful cook, so the food will be good. They've invited all their friends from school, but their cousins will be there too.
Well, I hope the weather stays warm so you can be outside. It sounds as if a lot of people are coming, but it all sounds fine to me. It'll be nice for you to go out at the weekend. You spend too much time at home studying. Now, what time does the party start and what time does it finish?
It starts at 8 o'clock and finishes about 12:30. But Jane's going as well, and her dad will collect us and bring us home afterwards. It's all arranged.
It'll be difficult for us to take you. Mum and I are going to see a film which starts at 7:15. Let's see. Why don't we collect you and Jane at the end of the party? Then you could ask Jane's dad to take you both to the party at 8.
I'm sure that'll be fine. I'll go and give Jane a ring.
Just one thing, though. We'll pick you up at 11:30. I really think that's late enough.
Oh, Dad! That's so early. Remember, we don't have to go to school on Sunday. Don't make us leave an hour before everyone else.
Well, I suppose it is the weekend. Let's say midnight, but definitely no later.
But...
That's my final decision. Now, go and ring Jane before I change my mind.
Okay.
All right. Let's look at questions 20, 23, and 25. I think these are, maybe 24 also are really examples of pragmatics. So does anyone want to talk about the way in which a learner would have to get those answers?
Intonation, the way father like forms his like super segmentals mostly, right? Like his intonation.
Okay, intonation is certainly a part of it.
Context too.
Yeah, absolutely the context. What tells us that Anna's father insists that she leave the party at 12? He never said, "I insist that you leave the party at 12," right? So how do we understand that he insists?
I think that's relying on language no later than 12, or he gave a specific time and repeated it. And she complained, basically. I think that's how we can.
Yeah, and he sort of put a stop to it and said, you know, there's going to be no more discussion. This is my final offer, right? So this is an excellent example of pragmatics in discourse, right?
But for 23, I didn't think her father was worried about her attending the party.
No, it's false.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. But again, he doesn't. I mean, whether he's worried or not is not something that he comes out and says, right? So we have to understand through implication and indirect speech how he feels about. It's not a matter of, you know, what time does the party start? It's how does he feel about her attending the party? So I think this is a really good example of pragmatics and assessing pragmatics. And to Perry's point, this is the only example that I know actually of where I've seen pragmatics actually tested. This is absolutely the only example. So otherwise, I think Perry said he couldn't find anything, and it's pretty true.
So there seems to be a big overlap here because it is a receptive skill between what this description of pragmatics and just making inferences.
Well, that's part of it, isn't it? Pragmatics, indirect speech, understanding moods and attitudes.
And we do assess that, right? There's lots of assessment of that, is there not, of inference?
Can you say more about that? Of inference?
Well, I mean, I don't think that a lot of people, when we did some looking a couple of years ago about, you know, there are many different kinds of inferences, and there's not much done about those different types and which ones are more difficult to make, you know. So that's kind of a wide open subject, but it does seem to me to be not separate from pragmatics. So they seem a little combined here, where I would think of pragmatics as more, you know, choosing a response, if it's a receptive thing of, you know, what would be the next appropriate thing to say, whereas inference is something you're drawing from what other people are doing. Pragmatics to me implies you must then engage in an appropriate way.
Well, right, and and the way I look at it is that inference is only a part. Well, there's an overlap, but it's also smaller than pragmatics. Pragmatics is much more than just making inferences, right?
Agreed. But those questions seem to me to be more in the area of inference.
Okay.
I mean, what do you see as them being more in the bigger field of pragmatic? I really ask you, what do you think why do you think the one about what time they can, if they're going to collect, which is a true false question, is a pragmatic question? Because I don't see it, and I'd like to understand.
Well, only because the question wasn't what time, but the question was that whether or not the father insists that.
No, the first question about collecting at a certain time.
Oh, sorry. No, I didn't mean, let's go back. I'm sorry. Let's go back to those questions. I didn't mean that all of them test pragmatics, only some of them. So
right. So the first one, you said 20, you circled it and said that's a pragmatic question. So I'm genuinely asking, why is that a pragmatic question?
Anna begins by asking her father to collect her. Actually, she didn't, right? She began by asking him if he could drive her there. Right. And it's her. But I think for me, the thing that brings it under the umbrella of pragmatics is that it's her opening remark. So, right. So opening conversations, closing conversations fall under that category of pragmatics. So for me, this one, maybe this is not central to pragmatics, but I would still see it as somewhat in the realm of pragmatics. And I mean, and absolutely disagree. That's fine. But
yeah, I know. I'm not trying to do that. I'm just trying to understand how you're viewing it.
Sure. And I know just I'm actually involved with Cambridge Assessment. I'm actually a writer and editor for Cambridge Assessment. So I know that these attempt, and feel free to say, well, I don't think it does a very good job, and that's fine. But I know that this particular section of this particular test attempts to measure pragmatics. That's its goal. That's one of its stated aims. So if you say that number 20 doesn't really make it, fair enough. I mean that's a valid criticism. But at least the attempt here is to measure something more than lexicogrammatical perception or comprehension.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just wonder how you understand that if the item is good for that particular issue when you do the item analysis. How do you know that that's what it's doing?
Right. Well, I mean, I'm not sure that I know what you mean by item analysis, because item analysis usually refers to statistical measures that measure reliability, right?
Right. So how do you know that this question, if this is an attempt to measure an ability to employ pragmatic skills, then you have to analyze it to see if it does that. If you only analyze it to see, well, did everybody get it right, or did they get it wrong, or does it actually measure what you wanted it to measure? How do you know?
Right. So validity arguments are always done through qualitative. I've seen validity arguments that are quantitative, but generally validity arguments are done in a more qualitative way. So it's about constructing a validity argument. It's not obviously not a statistical measure. I don't know. I don't know I don't know what anyone said about this particular test, but I can say that, opening strategies fall under that rubric of pragmatics. So I think by not saying Anna wants her father to pick her up from the party, but Anna begins by asking, that's probably the kind of argument they're going to make. And again, point well taken. Maybe this particular item is not well done, right? But I think certainly, 23 and 25 are probably the best examples of pragmatics in being tested in a receptive way. That's my feeling.
I tend to agree with Jacqueline. I think it's more of a question of inference. And
Mhm.
I don't know if you would, if you ask the students about this, probably they would just go by what they heard and the answer. I don't think they would be able to articulate a pragmatic concept that they understand and we're applying.
Yeah, I don't know. That's a really good point, because I mean, asking the students is always a valuable thing, right? The test takers, but I don't know if that degree of metacognitive comprehension of just what's happening in their language comprehension is really important. I mean, whether the students can say I understood this because I've achieved a certain level of pragmatics, or whether they can just say, oh, yeah, I understood that when he said, is it hot in here? He wanted me to open the window, right? He really meant that he wants me to get up and open the window. Is it really, I mean, if they can do that, then they are demonstrating pragmatic knowledge, right? Or pragmatic performance. Yeah.
I understand. I think we all understand what pragmatic means, but I will also submit to you that pragmatic knowledge doesn't necessarily come from the language. It comes from your own experience.
Absolutely.
So regardless of the language you're speaking, is your own experience in interactions with other people that you get to understand, oh, they mean this, oh, they mean that. So I think it is for me, it's a stretch to say that these items are testing pragmatics. It is a stretch.
Point well taken, really, really point well taken. Let's go ahead. Let's go back. And just some other points about testing pragmatics, or ways that we can test pragmatics would be discourse completion tasks, right? Where you're given a sort of a situation and students need to fill in what would be the next thing that this person says, right? Role plays, right? Or socio-pragmatic judgment tasks where they're asked to make judgments about pragmatic meaning in certain situations that they essentially see and hear. Okay, we're almost out of time, and we didn't really get to automated speech assessment, but I just wanted to close. We have about 5 minutes to close with some discussion questions. Which of these new assessment techniques do you already use in class? Which of these new assessment techniques would you like to try? And are there any that you would not like to try? So I'm just going to open the floor. Any comments?
I think that, at least in my case, I've tried probably all of them without knowing what they were. I think you gave me a good taxonomy to differentiate what I do. But I think in one degree or another, I've tried all of them. I'm still toiling with the difference between integrated and dynamic, but other than the theoretical based on them, but I think sometimes it depends which, like Jacqueline said, what is the point of what you're assessing? You might want to favor one or the other.
And I think there is a lot of overlap between all of these things that we've looked at today, really. Right. I mean, I don't think they can just be siloed necessarily into one category or another, and to say that if it's this, then it's certainly not that, right?
No, I don't think anyone's saying that.
Yeah.
But I do think that this does sort of lend the thought of that maybe pragmatics are better served by alternative assessments, because they do allow for the person to then demonstrate that they have an idea about what would come next or what the person meant. Where discrete item, I really do wonder about how they're going to assess those items and say that they actually do measure that. But the alternative ones, I mean, they're a natural way to see whether the person is understanding what's going on, and then to try to figure out why, if they don't, what's going on, right? Where is it that understanding, derailed? Was it vocabulary? Was it something else? Was it, just as Letty said, lack of experience with these certain kinds of exchanges? Then you have a much wider way to kind of get at in a less formal way what's going on, and then do some kind of meaningful intervention.
Right. Yeah, if you are really interested, I've never done this, although I know you can do it, but I've never done it. You can go to Cambridge Assessment's website. You can look up, that's the PET, P-E-T test, and you can look up the listening test. And there is a validity study, and you can read through all of that. I've never really done that, but there'll be something there, I'm sure. Yeah. Other comments or questions? I think we're almost out of time. So I want to say thank you. Thanks for listening. Thanks especially for participating. We want to again thank our sponsor, Mark Agren, who is an ELTS trustee. He's also a commissioner for CEA and a past TESOL president from 2009, 2010. Next month, in exactly 28 days, actually on March 16th, we'll be looking at assessing speaking. So I'd really invite you to come back if you're interested. And again, thank you very much. Any last questions or points?
No. Thank you. Good for thought.
Great discussion.
Good for
Really
thought
good.
this time.
Yeah.